I would like to talk today about influence, because influence is such a big thing today. In fact, you may have come across the term influencer. How many of you are familiar with the term influencer? Yes, it is somebody who has essentially a large number of followers, mainly in the social media. Probably a celebrity, but not necessarily so. So that this person actually can influence your purchasing powers, or decisions rather. If, let's say, a person A has 10,000, 20, 15, whatever, 50,000 people following her and him, there may be a company which will say, oh, this person is writing some interesting blogs about traveling to a country XYZ. And this scenery and the whole environment actually fits very well with our olive oil. So why don't we approach this person and offer some good money to have a little logo, you know, on the, I want to promote any particular social media here. And maybe people who actually follow this person will decide to buy our olive oil, you know, and so on. So it's actually a big business. And it has been estimated that the market for this business by 2020 can be anything like 17, 18, 19, 20 billion pounds. So this is how much money various organizations are willing to pay to people who influence you and me to buy something if we follow them in the social media. So it's quite a big business. So influencer is a big business. In fact, secular newspapers, as far as I was able to see, when they comment on people who try to be innovative in the cyberspace and put some new forms of evangelism, they don't call them evangelists anymore. They call them young Christian influencers. So that's who you are. And maybe the challenge for Newbold is to educate the future generation, not of theologians and pastors, but Christians influencers, because that's the term that the world increasingly recognizes and adopts when it comes to religious matters, especially Christianity. Influence, of course, is a Latin word in its origin. It means influere, to flow into somebody. It implies power, and it's about power, but it's also about the person. We say, oh, she has been such a good influence in the church, or the opposite. So I think influence is about power. And the English word influenza, of course, can tell you, if you have influenza, you know what influence is, because there is something that overpowers you to such an extent that you are no longer able to do or even think how you would like. Now, I would like to use the biblical texts for the reflections on influence. And I would like to take the story from the 2 Kings. But before I do that, I just want to say a couple of words about the 1st and the 2nd Kings. When I was on holiday this summer, I was actually writing this sermon while the rest of the family was, you know, swimming and the rest of it. And on one very hot day, I wrote something like, I thought this was going to be a very clever introduction, you know. You probably don't take the 1st and the 2nd Kings with you to the beach to be the main reading together with the sun cream and the sunglasses and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, that's a wonderful sentence. I'll just leave it there. It's going to capture, you know. But then something happened to me, which hasn't happened before or after. I went maybe on the same day or day after, I'm not sure, to the beach. And I was sitting under the pine trees in the shade, and I was watching people around. And then what caught my imagination, or my attention, was a family, and there was a young girl, and he was making notes quite rapidly on the large notebook. And then I looked closer, and I saw a book which had a familiar shape. And then I didn't want to be, you know, intrusive or not polite. And I was kind of looking with more attention, and the book had familiar columns, and then there was, you know, a number in each column or on each page. And I thought, oh, this might be the Bible. And then I was looking even closer, and I saw the cross hanging from the person's neck. And finally, I gathered all the courage I could, And I approached, and because English is not my native tongue, I just thought, I'm going to use the most polite expression I ever learned in the School of English. I was wondering, would it be possible, to interrupt you? They were Germans, they didn't understand me at all. But I saw on the front page, the Bible. And then I realized this person actually reading the Bible and is making the notes for quite a long time. And I thought, look, you just wrote in your sermon that people assumingly don't take the Bible to the beach and they read, and you thought you're going to kind of amuse your Adventist audience. Look how foolish you are. People actually do take the Bible, And I was corrected in my thinking. And then I approached this person and I said, look, I think it was broken English, but we understood each other. This lady was studying the book of Isaiah on the beach and making notes. Maybe she was a theology student, I don't know. But certainly that went for a long time. And the next day they disappeared. I never saw them again. So it's interesting how these things sometimes coincide. You write something, you want to make a point, and then somehow, as if you're corrected, no, actually no. People do take the Bible to the beach and they read there. Now, that hasn't changed the fact that perhaps 1st and the 2nd Kings are difficult stuff to read, even on the beach, because so many facts, so many kings, so many different names, so many different years to remember, so many different periods, some 40 years, some 6 months, some even a month. I mean, it's all complex, it's complicated. Occasionally it's very uncomfortable because there are some unpleasant killings there. And it's messy. It's all mess. It's very messy. And some people could say, well, I mean, who really cares today about the problems of the ancient kings of Israel and Judah some 2,500 years ago? That was a long time ago. Who really cares? But if you feel that it is the mess that you encounter in that book, that's exactly the point that is worth exploring. Now, students are sometimes asked to write reflection papers. Rod knows this, and some other people who work in higher education. And the whole point about writing reflection papers is that you actually reflect. You give some serious thought to something that was your experience, or like an internship or a process you went through, or event. And the whole idea is to look back and reflect and say, oh, this was good, this was bad. Maybe this could have been done differently. Maybe this could have been improved. And it's all part of learning. You learn, you grow, you develop, you mature. That's the whole idea. That's what a good reflection paper is all about. To learn some lessons and to change. And I think if we approach the 1st and the 2nd Kings like a one big reflection paper, I think it helps with the reading. Because that's what it is essentially. It's in approximately, I think, about 39,000 words. It gives a very solid reflection. Now, God's people are in a mess. They're in Babylon. They're in exile. They lost everything. There is no temple, there is no land, there is no territory, there is no identity, there is no national dignity, there is no sovereignty. What happened? How did we end up like this? What went wrong? So through a series of very carefully structured accounts, if you want to read, we get really a unique insight into the processes and events and characters leading to this tragic outcome. We get unique insights and information about various influences that were shaping and modeling events and people, which resulted in the end in a total disaster. So one can find a real drama behind what seems to be a very dry and boring facade. And one event in particular, I would say, even though technically it is not part of the 1st of the 2nd Kings, but is actually organically, I think, linked to that story, is that momentous decision that is recorded in the Bible in 1 Samuel in chapter 8. That momentous decision of the people of Israel to have a referendum or a plebiscite, if you like. which comes from Latin, plebs and decree. Common people issuing a decree what kind of government and the political system they want. And you know the story very well. People of Israel, they come to Samuel because they are unhappy with the corruption going on in the high circles. And they want to change the system. They want the monarchy. And Samuel is not happy, but God says, hang on, restrain your unhappiness because I have a job for you to do. And your job is to tell the people before they take the final people's vote about the consequences. I want you to inform the people of Israel what exactly will result from your democratic vote. And Samuel is not allowed to manipulate, to tell the half-truths. He's not allowed to create fancy or catchy slogans that will capture popular imagination. He's not allowed to create algorithms that will reach various constituencies. His job is to just tell the truth, just the plain truth. Because God is not the God of lies. God is not the God of a manipulation. God is not the God of half-truths. God is the God of truth. And God expects from all the people who follow him to abide by the same standard. So in that story, God eventually says, okay, fine, I will respect the results of your referendum, Israel. But before you vote, I want you to have a complete and accurate information about the consequences of your decision. And as we know from that story, the people of Israel reject God in a referendum or in the plebiscite, and the monarchy is created. So the whole point about this story in the first and the second Kings is that there is a reflection going on. There is a reflection going even perhaps back to that event, which says, look, was it really worth it to go through all that mess to end up in Babylon, so far away from the target that was originally envisaged and perhaps promised? So I think if you take this perspective, it becomes a much more interesting and palatable reading. And one place where I would like to go to and land in the second Kings is actually in the chapters 11 and 12. This is what we had the scripture reading on. Now, I would call it perhaps, if somebody was going to make a movie on the first and the second Kings, I think you could make several seasons. It would be a good material for several seasons of something like a Game of Thrones, but with a slightly different emphasis, perhaps. And one episode that I think could be created in that whole serial could be called A Chance for a New Beginning. Or if you like, after the clouds, the sun, modeled after the Latin expression post nubila fabus. You know, when there are clouds, there has to be a sun in the end. And that's the story that we heard part of this morning, which is in chapters 11 and 12. Because up to that point, before Joash appears on the scene, we had lots of clouds. We had Jehu, we had massive killings. I don't know how the filmmakers would portray that. And then we had this awful rule of Athaliah, the only woman who was the queen of Judah at that time. And we followed the 6 years of her reign. And of course, when her son, Ahaziah, was killed, she suddenly wanted to become a queen. But she didn't have a legitimate claim to the throne. And in those days, if you don't have that, there is a shortcut. You just kill everybody. And that's what she did. She decided to obliterate the entire royal family, including her grandchildren. And I think if there is any place for reflection in that story, this is one of them. Under normal circumstances, what is that the grandmothers do to their grandchildren? Do they kill them? No. They take them to the kindergarten. They tell them the stories. They love them. But in a twisted world of a declining monarchy, grandchildren are not just grandchildren. They are competitors. They have to be killed. So she did kill her grandchildren, one probably of the lowest points, which shows what happens when people become degraded and degenerated because of their obsession with power. So she is portrayed in this story, and then what happens is she's gone. And we heard how Jehoiada, the high priest, intervened. But I think we have to pause here, because when she kills almost all of her grandchildren, there is only one left, but there is a real danger at that point that the entire line leading from David to Messiah could be broken if the whole family is gone. So it's a very dramatic moment, actually. And who knows then what happens to the future if that line leading from David to the Messiah and the whole promise is actually broken. So there is everything rests on that little boy who is, as you know, kept hidden in the temple for some 6 years. And then Athaliah is gone. Now, with Athaliah finally gone, there is a chance for the new beginning. There is a chance to open a new chapter. There is a chance that there will be some sun after the clouds. But as you read the story, you wonder, is it going to happen automatically? By default? Do good things happen by default? Just spontaneously? Or do we need somebody, a character, through whom God will actually exert His divine influence to facilitate that transition from dark, unpleasant times to good times? And of course, the story tells us that there is such a man, and his name is Jehoiada. He is the high priest. We met him already previously. We met him. He was instrumental to remove Athaliah. Now, Jehoiada finds himself in a situation where he has a very young king who is, quite frankly, more suitable to go to Newbold primary school than to rule at the age of 7. So we have what is called technically co-regency. And Jehoiada has in front of him this whole unwritten big board, sort of tabula rasa. He can shape this young man to go into this direction and to go into that direction. He has all the power of the world to instruct him, to instill the values in him that will determine the future of the kingdom, that will determine the worship of Yahweh, that will determine the fate of these people. So he has a tremendous responsibility on his shoulder. And we don't know what Jehoiada did and how he instructed the young king. We don't know, the scripture doesn't give us the interactions between him. We don't know about the strength of his dedication, the choice of words, his pedagogy, his level of patience. But we know from the scripture that something good is going on. Because as long as Jehoiada instructs the young king, things are going well, says the scripture. Some translations use the word because, trying to say it was because Jehoiada instructed Joash. Some other commentators say, no, that's reading too much. But there is certainly an overlap. As long as there is a good influence behind Joash, things are going very, very well. And I think as we read about this example of Jehoiada and Joash, we get a picture what is a good mentor. We get the idea of what a good mentor can do and should do in various contexts, in the church, in the family, in different organizations. Because Jehoiada is building, is constructing Joash. And there are some people in education who believe in the idea of deconstruction. They believe that the whole education and influence is about deconstruction. All you have to do is just deconstruct. But that's not the point. From this example, we see that yes, sometimes maybe there is a need for deconstruction. But the most important job in influencing people, in educating them, whether it's for degree or just in a normal setting, is actually construct, build people, instill the values that will prepare them for what is to come. And I have seen personally victims of such a concept where people were just subject to deconstruction and they were eventually ruined because of the lack of proper construction. So Jehoiada is engaged in a work of construction. He's building the young king. He's preparing the young king because the young king really has a big job to do. He has to undo the years of Athaliah's reign, that devastating trail that was left behind her in terms of worship of Yahweh and the temple and the infrastructure, and particularly the minds of people who had to live under such circumstances. And in doing so, of course, Jehoiada has to be very careful. He has to be using all his abilities to build the king in the right direction. He cannot use what I would say unprofitable words, useless words, idle words. He has to focus on the task ahead and be very strategic about this. And as I read this story and this arrangement between Jehoiada and Joash, what came to my mind are the words of Jesus, which we find recorded in Matthew 12:36. Now, Jesus had a very heated exchange with the Pharisees. And at the end of that story, Jesus says, not just for the Pharisees or to them, but actually he uses the word everyone. And this is, if you think about it, this is quite a challenging place in the Bible because everyone means everyone. But I think it's particularly relevant for people who use words to influence others, like educators, lecturers, teachers, pastors, preachers, church members. But not just for them, because I think today, with the advent of the social media, we all have access. We all can express ourselves. Maybe not in the mainstream media, but certainly in the realm of the social media, we can all exert influence. And I think the words of Jesus come very relevant in the world today. So what does he say? Well, he said, I promise you, on the day of judgment, everyone will have to account for every careless word that he or she has spoken. Everyone, no exception. Not just the clergy, not just the pastor, everyone. And different translations use different terms. Idle, inactive, lazy, thoughtless, unprofitable, injurious, careless, useless, empty, worthless. But when you kind of reduce this to a common denominator, what you get is that Jesus is saying, look, the words that you speak, or you're supposed to speak, they are supposed to do some kind of work. They are supposed to exert some kind of influence in the environment where they're spoken. And one can speak words like this, or communicate like this, or one can speak words which are really slow, which don't go anywhere, very sluggish. Words that can be compared to an employee who is told to do a job and it takes normally 10 minutes to do it, but he never completes it because it doesn't go anywhere. It just stays where it is and eventually is wasted. So Jesus says if one spends his or her life creating words like this, words that really are not producing any value for the kingdom, in the end God will say, okay, can you tell me how you use these abilities that I gave you to produce words, to create sentences, to convert your thoughts into expressions, oral or written? Can you tell me, can you explain to me how did you use your vocal cords, your tongue, your mouth? How you use these wonderful facilities that I gave you, providing, of course, you're not unwell. And because I teach business studies, at this point, I'm thinking of God, people who work in business, if I can say, Rune, they know how much effort and energy goes into preparing financial statements at the end of the quarter or year. And what these people do, they actually prepare statements that stewards or managers communicate to the owners, to the shareholders, and say, look, this is how I used my capital, or how I used your capital in the last 3 months or 6 months. And then the owners judge and say, well, you've done it well or didn't. And that's what God does here, an example. He behaves like a shareholder who says, look, I gave you the capital, now it's time to account how to use it. So if you spend your life producing words and thoughts, creating effects and consequences which are actually contrary to the kingdom, you need to explain that. Why did you do that? That's the simple meaning, I think, of this expression. Now, I think we live in a particularly challenging time because the words of the social media is giving us opportunities, but also dangers. But before we do that, I just want to plant a little idea in your mind to influence you, if you allow me, with regards to that. Something that hopefully you will remember, if nothing else from this sermon, that you remember this little detail. That's my goal, to influence you. So when you go next time to the place, certain place, you will say, aha, I remember that from the sermon. There is a connection. I would like to try to connect the gospel, Matthew 12:36, and your shopping experience. I don't know whether we can do that. Because for those of you who are familiar with the UK environment, you will know that there is a company which actually is in Bracknell in Princess Square at the end, on the left, just next to the Specsavers, and across the nation, of course. And you probably shop there online or physically. The word that Jesus uses here, the words which are idle, unprofitable, useless, is spelled A-R-G-O-S, or Argos. Although my Greek friends told me you should pronounce it like Argos. So when you go to a certain company and you do shopping, just remember that corporate name, which was actually created from a different basis, is the same word that you find in 12:36 in Matthew, warning you not to use unprofitable or idle words. And the whole world of the social media is the world where we can do both. We can be influencers, but we can also use a lot of unprofitable, idle stuff. And I leave to your discerning judgment to go there and test what you see in that place, whether it conforms or not to what Jesus said. Sometimes, that's my personal opinion, when I see what people put, I just have the impression, good Lord, they have forgotten, or they don't think that what Jesus said actually matters anymore. Anyway, going back to Jehoiada. Now, Jehoiada is feeding the young king. I think not with the words which are Argos. He's feeding the young king with good, profitable stuff. He's influencing the young king with good things, the things for the kingdom. And when we read the rest of the account in 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 4 to 16, we can actually see the results of this influence behind Joash. If you read the account carefully, you will find that what Joash did, or what Joash does, largely, I think it's safe to say, reflects the work of Jehoiada. Because the first thing Joash wants to do is to repair the temple. But then we read about the gap of 23 years. Things don't go well. People who are in project management know if there is a problem, you have to intervene somehow. He does. Admittedly, after 23 years, but he does. And he makes some changes there. He changes the fundraising model, and he does something which is quite remarkable. He actually redistributes the power away from the clergy more towards the laity. Always a controversial move, just to make sure that the temple renovation is going ahead. And that's something that you normally study if you take a project management qualification. So he's a quite good project manager with Jehoiada behind it. And you can see that these lessons, these instructions are giving some results. But then something strange happens, which I think is very telling and very worrying for us. else. And that's what I would like to use the next 7 minutes before I finish the sermon. In the story of the 2 Kings, Joash is eventually killed. And we find that he's killed because there was a rebellion by his own people. It's a kind of very confusing point, because on one hand, everything is going well, Jehoiada is behind, and the temple is being renovated, there's a good influence, things are going forward, and then suddenly there's a kind of anticlimax. And you wonder what is going on, what went wrong. But to find the answer, we have to go to the 2 Chronicles, which has a complementary account or a parallel account. And then we find a very interesting fact, that we find that after some 130 years, Jehoiada dies eventually. He lived a blessed life. And you wonder what happens in somebody's life if the source of good, stable, solid influence is gone. What will happen to Joash if the good influence behind him is gone? Will Joash continue along the same route, or are we going to see a sudden change of direction? And we read that when Jehoiada is dead, the people around Joash come forward and say, look, we want to change. Suddenly you realize, oops, perhaps Jehoiada was very alone in that royal court. Perhaps people around thought differently but never dared to express it. And they say, look, we want the reinstatement of the worship of Baal. We want to go back because it's so much fun. Will Joash, having been exposed to good, solid influence, the value-building exercises for such a long time, will he resist and say, no, this is wrong, and we need to continue along the path that we have been so far? Or will he suddenly change and make a U-turn? Without knowing the story, what would one predict reasonably? That he will stick to his values. But he doesn't do that. There is a sudden, unexpected U-turn. Joash agrees to the change of direction. He agrees to the advice of his counselors. He completely negates what had been going on before. And I cannot explain why to myself. I just can't. Why such irrational choice? And even worse, when the son of Jehoiada says, look, this is wrong, you need to change that, Joash gets him killed. Kill a son of somebody who had been your faithful instructor and mentor and friend probably for I don't know how many years. What happened? Was Jehoiada a bad tutor who never allowed Joash to grow and become an independent moral thinker? Or was it just an opportunist? Joash, an opportunist whose obsession with power was so great that he really disregarded everything else. But when I read this story, and the ending particularly, the question that comes to my mind, if it happened to Joash, can it happen to me? If it happened to him, what are the guarantees that this may not happen to me? What happened to Joash, really? And that is actually a scary thought. Is this a story, a warning that there may be some sinister factors around us and perhaps in us who are waiting for the moment when we stop using that good influence behind? And if we lose one source of good influence, that we are not careful to replace with it somebody else or another source of influence. Forces that are waiting just to strike and swallow like they swallowed Joash. So I think that ending is quite telling. There are heroes in the Bible, like Joseph, who resisted the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, like Daniel, obviously, like Jesus, who stayed regardless of the consequences, who stayed regardless of the changes in the environment, who prove the point that values can be upheld and unchanged, even though the environment changes. But there are characters like Josh who say, no, the environment changes and the value system collapses. Whatever we may have thought about ourselves and how strong our values are. And I'm asking myself where I am on this scale. Am I closer to Josh or am I closer to David and Joseph and Jesus? And I'll leave you with this dilemma to ponder about. How important it is to have a daily influence from divine sources to be able to withstand the environment. How important it is not to finish the race halfway through. Now, there are some colleagues here who are theologians in this audience, and I'm not qualified to make this statement, but when I read this story, I was checking the genealogy in Matthew and Luke, and I was trying to find the name Josh there, and it's just not there. Now, I don't know, is this just a scribal omission, or is this a theological statement? But he's not definitely part of that lineage. And that reminds me of the word of Jesus, that the race is to be done and won until the very end, not halfway through. So I pray that each of us finds that daily, incessant source of influence that will shape our values and our behavior until the very end. May the Lord bless you.